No Small Endeavor is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations. Hey there. Did you know that we have a newsletter? Just imagine if you could have one of your favorite ethics professors send you a list of things to reflect on, think about, practical actions with which to experiment, all on your way to sorting through what it might mean to live a good life. Well, that is the NSC Notebook. I riff on themes and topics related to the show and our guests. Sign up for my NSC Notebook today at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp. This is No Small Endeavor. You're listening to our unabridged interview with Professor Charles Marsh. I sat down some time back with Professor Charles Marsh. He's a professor of religious studies at the University of Virginia. He's the director of the Project on Lived Theology, authored numerous books, including the award-winning God's Long Summer, Stories of Faith and Civil Rights. He's also the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship. We sat down that day to discuss his book, Evangelical Anxiety, a memoir. It's a beautiful, moving, oftentimes sad, oftentimes funny book. And in our interview, we did find ourselves often laughing with each other. But it's kind of like the kind of laughter that might be best compared to two friends sharing war stories. And in our case, the war stories originated out of our conservative Southern Christian childhood context in which each of us was raised. It was the kind of laughter about episodes that were once painful, often acutely so, but now, well, it's a gift to know we were not alone. It's a lovely conversation, and again, a great book. Here's our interview with Professor Charles Marsh. Lately, my lovely wife, Laura, and I have been trying to clean up the way we do a lot of our chores and errands to simplify our lives. And so one of the ways we've tried to do that is to clean up the way we shop for groceries. And so recently, we gave Thrive Market a shot. And honestly, we're a big fan. You can get the same high-quality brands you love, but for less and without compromising your standards. They actually ban over 1,000 ingredients that are still allowed in U.S. products, and the site is super easy to shop. You can filter by diet, like gluten-free, paleo, keto, low sugar, vegan, so you're not wasting time reading every label. It's not just food. Thrive has supplements, household items, and clean beauty too. All vetted and all way more affordable than you or I expect. And the shipping, fast and carbon neutral. Head over to thrivemarket.com/endeavor to get 30% off your first order and a free $60 gift. That's thrivemarket.com/endeavor, thrivemarket.com/endeavor. It's summertime, and that means I'm now planning some of my summer adventures with my lovely wife, Laura. But wherever summer takes us, we all need nourishment that keeps up with our daily adventures. So I'm quite pleased to have just learned about Ka'Chava. Here's my experience so far, that the Ka'Chava whole body meal shake first tastes great. I must say, I thought it might not be possible, given that it is chock full of amazing stuff like 26 vitamins and minerals, 85 plus superfoods and nutrients, all to keep your body and mind nourished all day. I love me some coconut, so I immediately tried the coconut acai and was honestly surprised how great it tasted. I was also especially pleased to see that the 25 grams of protein in each serving is plant-based. So fill your day with Ka'Chava. Go to Ka'Chava.com and use code ENDEAVOR for 15% off your next order. That's Ka'Chava.com, Kachava.com, code ENDEAVOR for 15% off. Hello, friends. One of the things I've taught students for many years now is that one of the most important things they can do is pay attention to their meta habits, big habits that leave lots of things in their wake, and that this is key to living life well. For centuries, the cardinal virtues were thought of as just such meta habits, profound practices that have a disproportionately large impact upon your life. The four cardinal virtues: courage, temperance, prudence, and justice. They were considered essential to a good life, but today we hardly talk about them. Most people can't even name them. That's why we're launching a special 4-part series exclusively on NSE+. In this series, I'll take a deep dive into these virtues, what they mean, why they matter, and how they shape a meaningful life. Think of it like a private college course, except it's way practical. Join us on NSE Plus to start listening today. Sign up at nosmallendeavor.com and click Join NSE Plus. Charles Marsh is a professor of religious studies at the University of Virginia, director of the Project on Lived Theology. He was raised in Alabama, Roll Tide, in Mississippi. Is a graduate of Harvard Divinity School, did his PhD at the University of Virginia. The author of 7 previous books, including the award-winning God's Long Summer, Stories of Faith and Civil Rights. He was also the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and lives now in Charlottesville, Virginia. Today we're discussing his most recent book entitled Evangelical Anxiety, a memoir. Welcome, Charles Marsh.
Thank you, Dr. Camp, Lee Camp, fellow Alabamian. It is lovely to be here.
It's always good to have another Alabamian with me.
Yeah, I was born in Mobile, and then aside from 6 extraordinary years in Mississippi, spent my high school years back in L.A., Lower Alabama, as we say, and finished Dothan High School. My parents are Mississippians. I grew up in Alabama.
And rooting for Alabama, the University of Alabama.
Yeah, my father is a Southern Baptist minister. And I think without the sort of presbytery and the kind of Episcopal hierarchy and polity, if you're a Southern Baptist minister in Alabama and you want to stay in that pulpit, you got to root for the bear, or you're gone. So that was probably the source of his conversion, but it stuck with me.
Yes. Well, your new memoir, Evangelical Anxiety, I must say, it's such a beautiful exemplar of vulnerability and honesty and courage, and it's a beautiful book. And I found myself several times laughing out loud and tearing up a number of times. And so, thank you for the book. It's a beautiful book.
Thank you for those kind words, Lee. Yeah. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to speak with you today.
So you begin your memoir with 2 stories. The first one, a preacher at a downtown church in Charlottesville. Would you recount that story for us?
Yeah, so on a fair spring afternoon, sometime in the past 10 years or so, I went with my family to the Episcopal church that we attended at the time, which had recently set up an evening service on Sunday night that was popular with our, teenage sons at the time and with college students. Even though I gathered that theologically there was some kind of, shall we say, existential Lutheranism that was kind of percolating among the clergy there. It was a lovely, time. And of course, there's the Eucharist, and there was at the conclusion of the service a community meal that was catered by some local farm-to-table outfit. But on this spring night, I was sitting with my slightly guarded kind of posture in response to the sermon. I mean, I'm a minister's kid, okay? So I've listened to thousands of sermons, and I do sort of approach sermons sometimes with perhaps more caution than warranted. And on this spring evening, he said, apropos of nothing that I could gather, that it was his prayer that everyone in the congregation that evening would suffer a complete nervous breakdown by their 40th birthday. And he may have said 30th, I can't remember. I was rounding 40 at the time. And I came to attention, as you might expect, because he continued, only when we are completely broken at our wits' end, impoverished, obliterated, can we receive God's grace. And he said other things that sort of traded on that kind of I think, damaging trope as he meandered toward the end of the sermon, our lives are not a journey, with the air quotes. They are a train wreck, and I could feel at this kind of admonition that we all have nervous breakdowns, that God wants us to be utterly broken so that God can then be God. I begin to feel the rise of an old anxiety symptom that actually became quite pronounced by the time the sermon had ended. And I was sort of in the throes of deep physical and emotional agitation. So I gathered up my family, and we, as I say, we Ricky bobbed it in the beige minivan back to our home, not too far away. And the only thing that I could think of at that moment that I needed was in the medicine cabinet in the bathroom upstairs, to which I rushed, opened the cabinet, shook free a 0.5 milligram lorazepam from a jar, placed it on the tip of my tongue, and looking in the mirror, said something like, the body broken for you, amen. And on this particular evening, in any case, it delivered precisely the kind of calming effect I needed.
And that sort of experience, obviously, the sort of calling for a hope for a nervous breakdown among the parishioners was personal for you, obviously, because of the very next story you tell about your first semester at Harvard Divinity School?
Yeah, it is personal for me. I think before talking directly about the Harvard story, that I would later learn that other people in that congregation, perhaps that night, but certainly in the course of this season of sermons, and in the kind of theology that was preached there, that is really not terribly uncommon. I mean, maybe it's a more kind of extreme example, but it's still familiar to me from the kind of evangelical piety I learned as a child, that taught me to distrust my body and my desires. It taught me to do you remember the old 4 spiritual laws? To take the ego that was on the throne, bad, and take that off and put Christ on the throne, so that the ego could somehow be diminished, if not obliterated. But yes, it was. Hey, triggers are real, Lee, and it triggered, memories of my own history of acute anxiety, and the sort of animating episode that took place my first semester at Harvard Divinity School, which I talk about in the book. I know it's a harrowing chapter, and I don't want readers to think that this is a scary book to read, because I feel like as a writer, as a theologian who's taking on a difficult story, I want the reader to trust me. I want the reader to feel like there's a kind of generosity and an understanding that I'm not sharing these difficult memories as a kind of boast. And I can tell you that there is, within the genre of neurotica, a kind of bravado that has always put me off from books in which the author seems to be saying, "Hey man, I am so messed up, you wouldn't believe, and by the time you finish this book, you're going to be agitated too." But in any case, it's there in that chapter, and I wanted to, I just needed to present that story in its you know, non-redacted, realism. I was a first-year student in seminary, and of an evening, I came home from a long day of study. I was excited about the prospects of grad school and living in Cambridge and living, the intellectual life. But I also felt like there was so much in my spiritual and in my sort of emotional history that was sending up red flags, that this was sort of a dangerous trek for me to make. Because why? Because perhaps I would be immersed too deeply in the world, or in secular ideas, or in relationships that weren't compatible with evangelical notions that I had inherited. But I came back to my room after a long day of study and lay down to get a good night's sleep, and it was as if a high pandemonium broke out of the ceiling, and I suddenly became overwhelmed by dread and by terror, the likes of which I'd never experienced before. It was a acute anxiety attack, I would later learn, that was accompanied by fears of losing control over the bodily functions, autonomous functions, a sense that life as I had known it, the capacity to experience joy and happiness, all of that was over. The thing about it that makes it so heartbreaking is, people have, and I can tell you, and we're students, we know how anxious this generation of students has become. And, I see that in the classroom. I see that among friends. But at the time this happened to me, Lee, I had no repertoire at all for understanding what had transpired. The only way, as an evangelical Christian, that I could interpret this anxiety episode was through the kind of lens of suffering and of counting it joy that I had been unmade in this moment. I turned to some of my devotional favorites like Oswald Chambers and others who sort of encouraged me to say, this is part of God's deconstruction of your ego. And it took years before I could realize and accept the fact that all the biblical protocols that I turned to get me out of this madness, if you will, were dead ends.
You say at one point that regarding your upbringing as an evangelical in the South, son of a Baptist preacher, that, quote, an attempt to receive suffering as a gift was the only story available to me, end quote. And then you play off the way in which that then leads to a sort of Christian distrust of psychotherapy, or even a dichotomy between Jesus and therapy. So would you kind of unpack some of that for us?
Yeah. I at the time of my own breakdown, I knew nothing about psychotherapy, or even that psychotherapy, certain kinds of counseling would be places of healing and understanding for me. I mean, I was a philosophy and English major. I'd read my Freud. I had read psychoanalytic theory and the like. But I also, more deeply, was of a mind that, Christians say, we're too blessed to be stressed. We don't need modern or secular psychology to help us navigate the trials of life, we have the ultimate healer on our side and indeed indwelling our lives. The Holy Spirit is at work somehow in you in these these mental torments, and you should not. This kind of I would say misguided message that's coming through to me. You should not try to extricate yourself or to find a way out back into a steadier mind. You should embrace these torments as, refining fire, as a way of cleaving to God, and one of the most difficult parts of the story for me while writing to recall was not so much the episode or the particular symptoms, but it was just the fact that I believed I had to bear this indefinitely, and so days turned into weeks and months, and it was 6 or 7 years before I finally sat down with some professional mental health provider to say, look, I've been battling with these symptoms for 6 or 7 years. I cannot go on. Help. And began to experience what I would later understand as the grace of not only medical science, but the ability of a trained and empathetic therapist to help you craft a language that puts into a kind of more optimal form the sources of your mental torment.
So another kind of thread running throughout your book, thread might be not quite the right word, a cord, a heavy cord running throughout your book, is the way in which your story of anxiety, kind of from childhood onwards, is never far from stories of desire, and especially sexual desire.
Yeah.
So how do you see that sort of anxiety relate to sexual desire?
It's so interesting. I know you did your doctorate at Notre Dame, University of Notre Dame, and I taught at a Jesuit university for 10 years before I went to UVA, and love my time among the Jesuits and a theology department that was connected both physically and intellectually to the philosophy department. And I remember one afternoon visiting with a colleague of mine in philosophy, an Irish philosopher who some of your listeners may know. His name is William Desmond, and he's a sort of a beautiful wordsmith and a beautiful writer. And I was in awe of his knowledge of Hegel and Heidegger, and we're sitting in the quad talking, and it was a lovely day, and so our thoughts drifted from continental tradition and phenomenology and all of that to just sort of our stories, and I gave him just a sort of a little glimpse into precisely the point you raised about the beauty of this afternoon and the awakening of the spring and desire, and about sort of how, as a child, I received, let's say, very conflicting messages about desire. I mean, there was the desires of our hearts could be aligned with God, but the desires of our body were very likely impediments, if in an understatement, to union with God. And William said, well, I've always loved the way in which this is understood in the Catholic intellectual tradition that the person ascends the scale of erotic desire, the end of which she or he beholds the beauty of God. And I was like, wow, dude, that is definitely not what I heard in Southern Baptist Sunday schools in South Alabama and South Mississippi. How I wish that I could, kind of rethink my my sort of native distrust of desire, and my kind of the sort of the vigilance that distrust yields of always having to kind of micromanage your desires. Oh my goodness, what is desire for this? Desire for that? Measuring every desire against this ideal of sort of perfection and purity. And he said, well, Charles, it's not too late. I don't know, William, but I do think that you're absolutely right, and that this all, I think, clusters around a practice that I truly hope evangelicals across the political spectrum have abandoned, but it was very important in my childhood, called breaking the will of the child, which is really kind of breaking apart desire and turning desire into a kind of source of fear and temptation and anguish and introspection.
So it's not that. I guess the trick there seems to me is that on the one hand, I hear you saying that this sort of inherent distrust of desire that you received, in contrast to that picture that your Jesuit friend depicted, inculcated in you this kind of deep, basic anxiety. But I don't think you're saying that the solution is mere indulgence of desire, but that it's to see desire as a gift that has rightful and beautiful ends. Is that a fair way to say that?
No, absolutely. And I think, I do think I wish that I had been free to err on the side of indulgence. Yeah. That is to say, let's put this more precisely. I wish I had the capacity to think and act freely about in relation to desire. And so you're absolutely...
And instead you were on the side of what, repression?
Yeah, that desire is, it is a place that will lead to separation from God, that, yes, in some kind of theological way, I understood desire as proper, but in a way that was an ingredient to my body and to my mind and to my habits and to my practices and to my, psychological and spiritual development. I felt that desire had in the best case scenario been constricted, been narrowed to such a space that I had lost the capacity of freedom. And I come to this later when I ponder this really interesting idea in Dietrich Bonhoeffer called the strong sin, and this idea of the grace of the strong sin. And maybe it's better rendered by Flannery O'Connor, and maybe this is an apocryphal line, but it's true sort of many of her characters. If you don't get out there and sin, Jesus will have died for nothing. and so there is a sense in which if you don't feel that you have the capacity to sin, it's almost impossible to feel a capacity to feel forgiveness, to have the capacity to feel forgiveness and grace as not just as a spiritual response, but as a somatic, experienced response to all God has done for us in Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I think, reading your accounts of some of this, I don't think I've ever shared this on our show, but I flash back to an episode when I was getting, a lot of my friends, close friends will kind of roll their eyes because I've told this story to them so many times, but it indicates the way in which this sort of deep anxiety was inculcated in me around desire. In that we were hypersensitive about lust, sexual lust in my home church. No dancing, no wearing of shorts, and things of that sort. And so much so on the wearing of shorts, which is central to this story, there was to be no wearing of shorts in public. And so we were with our preacher on a youth group trip, and one day we were pulling out of this church we were visiting, and down the sidewalk, we were actually in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Coming up the sidewalk was a guy in a jogging outfit and jogging shorts. And our preacher, there's a van full of 12, 13, 14-year-olds. And our preacher sees this guy and he says, well, he looks real nice in those shorts. He'll look real nice in hell. With no sense, there was no irony intended about that. This was a very straightforward theological assertion. And so I think that a lot of people, perhaps who don't grow up in that sort of context, can't understand the sort of anxiety that gets inculcated in a person because these authority figures will say things like that. And so thus this becomes the great taboo that above all must be avoided.
Yeah, that is an amazing story. And I look forward to reading this in your memoir. I like so many Baptist evangelical boys of my generation, adored David Wilkerson and his great book, The Cross and the Switchblade. And the film adaptation with Pat Boone playing the role of the great evangelist. And at some point in my puberty, a cassette tape appeared in my bedroom. Never really had like father-son exchanges. Even my father was a Baptist minister. Instead, books and cassettes would appear in my room, like for boys only. And this cassette was a sermon by David Wilkerson called "Parking at the Gates of Hell." And it was precisely this, that, there's a slippery slope from wearing some, a normal person would be, just a pair of running pants down the road for a jog in Tuscaloosa, or as I heard the tape, the beginning of any kind of physical intimacy with a girl, holding a hand, would then lead to hugging her, would lead to a kiss, would lead to heavy petting. Also, I've always thought there should be a heavy metal band called Heavy Petting, and you were on the slippery slope, not just to, whatever may be the results of teen sex, but hell, eternity in hell. And so it's not an exaggeration to say that a lot of these great kind of spiritual and metaphysical kind of struggles, between the children of Jesus and the forces of Satan, were centered in the bodies of adolescents, and more precisely in their sexual identities and sexual lives. And so, I remember, I don't know how graphic we can get on the show, but I remember when I was going through puberty, how alarmed I was by the changes in my body and by the embarrassment that, young boys have of showing their excitement in opportune times, that I would start when I went out with friends, boys and girls, I would not only wear like a really small pair of underwear, but I would also take a really tight jock strap to put it over the underwear. It looks like some kind of like medieval chastity outfit, because I did not know how to understand my changing body. And it felt to me like this was the source of some deep conflict. Yeah, this is just heartbreaking.
Yeah, yeah. I think you unpack a lot of stories that I felt a number of feelings about, but I think the one of them that struck me so, maybe sadness is the right word. At one point you say, in my journal, I charted the slippery slope of the affections. 1, acquaintance. 2, casual friendship. 3, close friendship. 4, intimate friendship. 5, immorality and purity.
Yeah.
And I think about the ways in which what you're receiving, then you take all of these beautiful goods, and now all of a sudden they are not only to be distrusted, but are potential grave dangers to you.
I was basically copying handwritten notes from my spiritual journals as a 13 or 14-year-old boy in that section. And I remember finding these journals sometime in my parents' house in Atlanta when I was working on the memoir. And it was heartbreaking, and it was even more poignant by noticing that I'd spelled intimate INTIMENT. And you're right. These, rather than become these ideas, these virtues, these ideals, rather than sort of engendering a form and structure of a good life, become imprisoning.
Mm. Yeah. So not only the anxiety, theologically informed anxiety, infused with distrust of desire, but another kind of key chord in your story is moving to Laurel, Mississippi. And you say, as a boy, you didn't know at the time, but as later you realize that Laurel, Mississippi, where you move, how old were you when you moved there?
We were 10.
You were 10. You later realized that the FBI considered Laurel, Mississippi, the epicenter of Southern white terrorism. And you say that your experience was that everyone was angry and aggressive. You tell stories about how, even though looking back, you seemed like your neighborhood was safe, but nonetheless, you and your neighbors had bars across the windows of your house. Everyone has a dog. Unpack some of that for us. Describe that for us. How that has to be another kind of key element in anxiety for a 10-year-old.
Absolutely. The journalist Curtis Wilkie, in the past year, published his book called "When Evil Lived in Laurel." Evil Ruled in Laurel. I can't remember exactly the title, but it's about it's an excellent kind of narrative in which this epicenter of Southern terrorism is, given this kind of very thick researched kind of form, and I can say that within only a few days of arriving in this town, I began to sense, at a visceral and emotional level, the difference between this town that was regarded by the FBI as the epicenter of Southern terrorism. It was a home to the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan of Mississippi. At the time we moved in 1967, FBI agents were everywhere, seeking to not only put the remaining members of the Klan out of business, but to prosecute the perpetrators of civil rights murders and fire bombings and beatings and bombings. I did not know what was at stake in the civil rights movement when I was 10 years old, but I could tell you that the town exuded an ambient fear. There were evenings when my mother and I would go home from church in her car, when all the lights in the neighborhood, all the street lights, house lights had been turned off. I didn't know why. Gathered later, it had something to do with fears of some kind of imagined invasion. We were living in a state of collective paranoia. And when I say we, I mean white evangelical Christians, the last guardians of the segregated South, seeing that the struggle of white resistance, the struggle to preserve the sovereignty of our sacred South and all of our great virtues, the Southern way of life, that was coming to an end. The days were numbered. But we were not going to go gently. And there was a sense that we were being constantly besieged by menacing forces, whether those were federal mandates, whether those were given by through the civil rights movement, through white liberals, through Christian liberals, through magazines, through secular media, and the like. And so the sort of distrust that you might think is fairly routine of a conservative Christian in view of the world became intensified by this sort of sense of standing at the threshold of a new America, an America that would no longer, at least we thought at the time, things turned out to be a little different, respect the habits and practices of white conservative Southerners. And I felt enveloped by those fears. And they weren't only inchoate ones, as you mentioned. There were visible signs everywhere. The presence of guns, the presence of Confederate flags, the presence of attack dogs, of burglar bars at the house, the presence of marches and protest in both against the civil rights movement and on behalf of politicians and causes that we hoped would spare our defeat.
And the story that you tell of the day that Dr. King was assassinated?
Yeah. I was 10 years old. This was my first year in Laurel, the spring of 1968, and the principal in what proved to be the last all-white school system in Mississippi. That is the all-white public school system in Mississippi. The principal came over the loudspeaker and told the students that Martin Luther King had been murdered in Memphis, and everyone broke out into applause. And as I say in the book, I would like to believe that I did not join in that perverse celebration, in the spring of my 10th year, but I may have. We were all in this thing together. And while I understood that it was a kind of totalitarianism, even as a 10-year-old, the pedagogy, the environment, the teaching, it was oppressive and suffocating, but we felt this kind of loyalty to this vanishing ideal. And it would not be until the fall of 1970, 2 years later, that I very happily joined the first integrated class in the state of Mississippi.
We are most excited to announce that we'll be having our second NSC Plus book club with an author on June 26 at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. Professor Rebecca DeYoung will join us to discuss her book, Glittering Vices. It's a great book. Order your copy of the book and mark your calendars. If you're not yet a member of NSC Plus, join at the link in the show notes or visit nosmallendeavor.com and click Join NSC Plus. Show up with questions and get ready to sit in on a great conversation. You've mentioned already the sort of presumed exclusion between, to use the language a couple times used in the book, you have Jesus, you don't need therapy, you don't need psychotherapy. But in light of these varied sources of anxiety, at some point you began to investigate psychotherapy, psychoanalysis. How did you make the decision, and what did this begin to look like for you?
Well, part of that Southern evangelical inheritance that, if I may presume, you and I share in many similar ways, is kind of a culture of secrecy. We are not encouraged to think about our families and our family histories. We're not encouraged to really think critically or freely about our own interiorities, and so it was a difficult place for me to reach, not only as an evangelical Christian, with all of the pervasive warnings that were part of that culture about psychotherapy and the psychoanalyst being, just part of this sort of conspiracy against Christian virtue. But it was, coming of age in a family that had some very difficult secrets and stories that, if we had known, would make sense of some of the sorrows and tragedies of our family. But we were, we in both the Christian, in both our Christian lives and in our lives as white Southerners, we were supposed to kind of project this idealized version of ourself and our family. And it was not a version that included mental illness, or suicide, or divorce, or alcoholism, or drug addiction, and so many things. And in my own journey, I was able to kind of intellectually understand that kind of privacy and that sort of sense of loyalty to a family ideal was a historically determined construct. But it took a number of increasingly difficult and debilitating anxiety episodes for me to simply, if I may, reach a place of desperation when I realized that all these biblical protocols, my devotional life, all this sort of understanding of spiritual healing that was part of my evangelical inheritance, had perhaps a certain value, but I needed professional help, and I needed someone to look at me with all of the skills and gifts and kind of empathetic judgments of a cure of mental torment. And once I put myself in that space, I just remember, Lee, how shocked I was when I began this treatment in psychoanalysis in Baltimore. It was very difficult for me to say yes to this invitation of a young training analyst at Johns Hopkins University to undergo this 4-day-a-week treatment. I'd heard, and we all know these, the sort of stereotypical, often cartoonish portrayals of a psychoanalyst. But I had read enough Christian apologetics and to feel that I should never put myself in that position, because it would be a place where my mind was reformed according to. But anyway, I just remember how surprised I was when on a summer morning, I hopped on the couch and said to the analyst, what do you want me to talk about? And he said, you can talk about anything you want. And I said, okay. And I began talking about my first images of heaven. And then I finished, and he said, okay, the first of a million such ahas that would become the signal of what, progress in therapy? I don't know. I'd now like to hear maybe some words about your first picture of hell. And, well, that was a total buzzkill. I began talking, and you know what I didn't realize was that as an old evangelical, I was pretty good as an analysan. Like this kind of, as a child in the evangelical subculture, we tell our testimonies, right? The testimonials are a really important part of Christian faith and practice. And I stood and gave my testimonies many times in Southern Baptist churches. And, I never really had a dynamic testimony. That is to say, I was never a drug addict, or, I never did the Jim Morrison thing. And that really broke my heart that I didn't have a dynamic testimony. But I would try to come up with something, in my testimonial. What was involved here in this work of analysis, it's not kind of a brainwashing. It was a space to develop a narrative, a multi-layered testimonial, if you will, in the company of a skilled listener to understand more broadly the sources of my anxiety and to believe. I mean, this is very much at the heart of like the Jewish Christian imagination, that the word and that language, has the power to hurt, but it has the power to redeem.
Yeah, I think that that my own sense of going through a variety of experiences with therapy has taught me too the power of someone listening to oneself and asking good questions, and a space to re-narrate, or a space to express desire and even make it safe to express what a desire might look like, or what it might mean, or why we're afraid of it.
Yeah.
It just seems to be a profoundly powerful space that sets aside shame, and in setting aside the shame, then makes possible something new.
It does make possible something new. I love that rendering. And I want to say, too, that it took time to trust this therapeutic dialogue, because I had times as a boy, as a teenager, when I had confided in a youth pastor, about some personal sin or some personal struggle, only to feel rebuked, or to feel that I had gone into this conversation with an open heart and a hope to understand, but I left with a kind of judgment and a sense that you just need to do more. And it's that, my gosh, that is just so exhausting. That habit, that Christian message that, well, you just need to do more. You need to be better. You need to do this. And I remember feeling just physically freer when I began to see and to trust that in this therapeutic space, I could share my secret desires, and the world didn't end. It was part of understanding the complexity and intricacy of our, having been created in the image of God, formed in this image, and that our interior lives are rich and exquisite, and they can be a place of vitality and of growth. Yeah.
You say you don't. Your experience was not that you. I forget the language. This didn't birth you into a new resurrected life. But it does seem that you kind of, I think you make the turn to Bonhoeffer, where it invites you to engage the world anew in a sort of very lived, visceral way that kind of reframes desire and makes a sort of explicit engagement with all aspects of life. Talk to us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. Freud said that the purpose of psychoanalytic treatment was not to bring the suffering patient into some place of perpetual happiness, but it was to move the person who is experiencing mental torment from a place of neurotic suffering to kind of ordinary unhappiness. And I, in a book that you may have encountered in graduate school, not necessarily recommending that listeners run out and read it because it's a long, lumbering argument by a philosopher named Paul Ricoeur. It's a book on Freud by Paul Ricoeur. Ricoeur, taking the perspective of a person of faith, shows how, despite Freud's own kind of atheistic premises in a work like Future of an Illusion, for example, the psychoanalytic dialogue can, in fact, be an experience that not removing God as a credible belief, but that cleans or clears the imagination of idolatrous conceptions of God. So the way in which, as a Southerner, for example, I mean, you don't have to go to analysis to do this, but but that part of the analytic work is iconoclastic. It is a process of removing the kind of divine authority that becomes attached to cultural and political and familial, authorities and symbols. And he talks about this in terms of a post-critical naivete, that such analytical work, rather than sort of leaving one in this sort of critical place where you go the way of Feuerbach and you say that all human longings for God are projections about the infinite, quality of the human species, it can very well clear the ground of and the imagination of false gods and enable a new sense of kind of enchantment and wonder and freedom and a capacity to live and to act in a way that is consistent with what David Bentley Hart, one of my friends, calls the Christian movement. And I think that's a really important and often neglected part of our understanding of psychotherapy and psychoanalytic work. That if we can assume that the analyst or the therapist or the psychiatrist is there primarily to hear and to listen and to help us achieve this kind of new language of our personhood, a language that puts into perspective and gives an account of our suffering, I think that there's a redemptive purpose in the work, apart from whether or not it's, done in a Christian context or a non-Christian context.
Yeah.
That there's something about the humanness of this that is inherently beneficial. Which is not to say that there aren't psychiatrists and analysts and therapists who come into the work with, biases against religious persons. But, there are quite a number of men and women of faith who are in the sort of so-called secular mental health world. And one of the most influential books that I read early on in my own sort of journey of like, what should I do? Should I go into analysis? Should I be terrified of analysis? Was by a Christian analyst, psychiatrist at Yale Medical School named Stanley Levy. It's a wonderful, very accessible little book called In the Image of God. And as a practicing analyst and a very committed parishioner in his Episcopal church in New Haven, he talks about the kind of the symmetry between the body and soul, between the mind and spirit, and gives kind of birth to a much more kind of incarnational way of seeing the kind of therapeutic psychoanalytic dialogue.
It reminds me of we only have a brief time to note this because I have one last question I want to ask you after making this comment. But that reminds me, some years ago, and I've talked about this on this podcast before, but 7-9 years ago, I went through a season of some pretty serious depression, and I was trying to decide whether or not to take an antidepressant. And because I think I inherited a lot of these things that you're talking about, right? This mind-body dualism and so forth. But I called a friend of mine who's a psychiatrist and who's also read a lot of theology and moral philosophy that I like and that I trust, So I called him and I said, hey, I'm sure you can write me a long paper on this, or, you've written long papers on this. But I said, give me the short version of why, as a Christian, you think it's legit to take antidepressants.
Yeah.
And he said, I think this is almost a quote. He said something like, in my mind, the reticence to take antidepressants is a holdover of the Gnostic heresy that distrusts the brain as a part of the body.
That's brilliant.
Isn't that brilliant?
It is brilliant.
And I said, that's all I need to hear. Thank you.
Yeah. And I mean, my goodness, Lee, it's that Gnostic heresy that, you and I, in other contexts of our lives, in, for example, our interest in the civil rights movement, our interest in Southern evangelicalism in the 50s and 60s. I mean, it's that Gnostic heresy that we really discern in this, image of Jesus, who is worshipped, in the white churches, who isn't fully present
Right.
in the social order, who doesn't call us to really care or to think and to act mercifully towards our Black brothers and sisters living under the iron hard rule of Jim Crow. It's that Gnostic Jesus who we find only in this kind of, spiritual place that I think makes me remember once when I TA'd for a Roman Catholic historian in graduate school. And he said, the docetic heresy, the kind of Gnostic heresy, really is the most pervasive and corrupting heresy within the Christian church in its contemporary expressions, in failing, to bear witness to the created integrity of human condition,
that's well said.
of all creation. And I think that is so helpful in the context of thinking about psychiatry and the importance of medication. That there is indeed, if you, maybe this is taking it too far, but I remember when the summer of my first major depressive episode, I had been in therapy for years, but I had not taken antidepressants. And I looked up one day and saw that my psychiatrist had tears in her eyes because she recognized that the depression that I was in was a clinical depression, that language couldn't extricate me from this torment. And so she prescribed a fairly standard fare of antidepressants. And I remember this so clearly because this happened in the summer of 2006. And I was supposed to go with my family to Berlin on a sabbatical in January of 2007. And in that period of depression, I was immobile. I couldn't think about anything, and I feared everything. The last thing I thought I was capable of doing was going to live in a foreign country with my family. And within a month or 6 weeks, as the medication began to do its good work, I began to feel a kind of steadying of the ship, and a kind of baseline, sort of an increase of sort of baseline steadiness that I really never felt. And I don't want to turn this into a miracle story, but I will say that by the time we left for Germany, I was ready. I felt capable of doing this.
So you, the last part of your book, one of the chapters is something like Quiet Days in Charlottesville. So when you think about the this journey that you've described so beautifully in the book, describe for folks here in the last couple of minutes that we have, what's kind of life look like for you these days? What's the mental landscape look like for you these days? What's the rhythms of life look like for you these days?
Yeah, I wanted to offer reassurances to the reader. And I didn't wait until the end of the book to let the reader know that, hey, this narrator, he's going to be okay.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I wanted to end in a manner that that simply gave language, expression to the capacity I have found as I have aged, as I have grown, as I have developed I think a greater freedom to fail and to make mistakes. That there's beauty, in the ordinary. There's beauty in the rhythms of a day. As a young kind of passionate evangelical, I felt like I was sent out into the world with this almost kind of like messianic like purpose, and every day was a day of like being there in the front lines of the of the great cosmic struggle. Every day, was a day in which I had to make God real and be there and live in this kind of intensity. And I'm comforted, of course, by all of the writers of the Hebrew Bible and the heroes of the faith, those who have pointed us towards the kind of virtue and the ways of being still before God, of learning to not engage the world as the great white man on the scenes. The mess. I'm here to save the day. That kind of trope of the great white evangelical on the scenes, I think, has given us a lot of quite unfortunate ends in American politics and culture in recent decades, and there's something that Bonhoeffer says in letters and papers from prison. These last letters and fragments that he was writing before he was executed by the Gestapo. That as he's learning in the solitary life of prison, of being a prisoner of conscience, the beauty of God's creation in its exquisite unfoldings, and the joy of being still and quiet, learning how to participate in the world, learning how to think about the kingdom of God as in a way that is participatory and that is humble, acknowledging our failures, feeling chastened by our failures, but not feeling defeated by our failures. The capacity to live into our aging bodies, to love and to see things anew. I feel just quite grateful for this, the gift of life and the years I have left, and I feel like that chapter, the quiet days in Charlottesville, is, it's about this sort of it's about learning to I mean, it's not an easy lesson to learn, but it's about learning to be still in a nation of noisy, believers and distractions. I mean, that's what I want to be doing as I teach and write and listen and learn.
Been talking to Charles Marsh, professor of religious studies at the University of Virginia, about his most recent book, Evangelical Anxiety, a memoir. Thank you, Charles, so much for your beautiful work and your time with us today.
Thank you so much, Lee. It's been a great blessing.
Hey, friends, Lee C. Camp of No Small Endeavor here. Hey, would you like to expand the community of people talking about the things you like to talk about? Here's an easy way to do that. And I would be most grateful if you were to do so. Go over to your favorite podcast listening app, click on Reviews, and leave No Small Endeavor a glowing 5-star review. Tell folks perhaps about some episode you liked in particular, and tell folks what you like generally about No Small Endeavor, the topics, the dashingly handsome, articulate host, or whatever it is that floats your boat. That will help more people find us which will expand the community of people talking about the things you like to talk about, especially when you make it one of those 5-star reviews. Thanks. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriette Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.
From PRX.